Good afternoon, Legacy Bible Church.
Well, good afternoon. This is the first broadcast of the year, 2023. So happy New Year to all of you out there in Legacy Bible Church land. And Sarah, you're going to talk about something a little bit different on these weekly.
We're going to do something completely different. So what I wanted to do was start a series called Back to the Basics. And we're going to have a 10-part series. And we're going to just get back to the base. I mean, we're going to go all the way back. At some point, we will do the testimonies of Robin, Stephen, and I. That's how far back. I want to get back to just really how far back can we go. But today, I wanted to get back to the basics on.
Well, the Back to the Basics is back to the basics about the Legacy Bible Church ministry, right? Would that be fair to say?
It'd be fair to say the Legacy Bible Church ministry, yes. Starting from the very, very roots of it. That's my plan.
Who are we? What do we do? Why do we do what we do? Et cetera,
How did we get here?
How did we get here?
Who are we? Just really, and then of course, we'll always be open to any kind of questions that you might have about this ministry, because I want to. There's a lot of new ministries that pop up different places. And I think Legacy Bible Church is set apart because it's a teaching ministry. It's online. And I want people to know what we're about, why we got started. And that actually all begins with you and what got you started, even discovering the meaning of the gospel. So that's actually our question today. And it's, how did you discover the gospel as the New Testament authors intended? And I just wanted you to take us on that journey for you, because there could be people.
There are
people that not just look at you. People, I mean, probably think the same of me, but I know directly people that would think, well, does this guy coming in with a new revelation that is trying to win a whole bunch of people over to his side and drink the Kool-Aid, if you want to go there. That's what I don't want. I want people to know our heart. And so, and I know your heart, and I've had many conversations with you of this discovery of the gospel. And so I wanted you to take us on that journey.
Yeah. Because it really is, Legacy Bible Church really is, what does the Bible say and what does the Bible mean? That's really all we're about.
Nothing that you've come up and created one night laying awake in bed and decided to write your own Bible.
Yeah, and if people follow Legacy Bible Church ministry and teaching, they learn that we are very deep into the text. We don't fly above the text. We are very deep into the text of the Bible, particularly in the New Testament authors, but also the Old Testament, because they're like that. They're not two different testaments. It's the Bible, and we're deep in the text. That's Legacy Bible Church. That's what we're about. We don't add to it. We don't supplement it.
That's right. And you'll never see us just grabbing a scripture and
no proof
texting. Right.
We do not like proof texting.
So get us started.
Okay. Well, how did the question is, how did I discover the meaning of the New Testament authors? Would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Because yes, and which if you can, and I know it's hard, in a short little tidbit, you need to tell us what the true meaning of the New Testament is.
Okay.
Because
how about we start there?
Yes, and it has that one. Yeah.
Let's start there. And that's a deductive way of talking, where there are people wondering, where's this going? The true meaning of the New Testament all comes down to this, is that mankind was separated from God, and he sent his son to restore familial fellowship and connection between men and women and God only through the Son of God, Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. And that's realized, that's fulfilled. That's the full gospel is realized in the spiritual realm of spiritually spoken worship. What Paul called it in Romans 12:1, what the fourth evangelist has Jesus himself calling worship to the Father in spirit and in truth. And of course, just to make sure that we're not ambiguous here, this is the realm of speaking in tongues, properly understood. Please don't go to the baggage of certain charismatic traditions about speaking in tongues. If you listen to Legacy Bible Church, that's what we teach about speaking in tongues. What is it? What does it mean? What is it for? What's God doing when a subjective child of God in Jesus Christ, by the working of the Holy Spirit, is speaking in tongues, spiritually spoken worship to the Father in spirit and truth? What's God doing with that?
And
what's his purpose?
If you can hang with us and not jump to the other traditions and hang with us in this back to the basics, we are going to get,
we'll be talking
about that, because that is super important.
But that's the one thing, that's everything that the Father was looking at for this present age of the new covenant, was that men and women could once again, for the first time since the fall, in the Son Jesus Christ, by the working of the Spirit, be restored to everything he created human beings to be, which is his voice, his conduit into the creation. That's the gospel.
That's the gospel, to be restored to the tree of life.
Yes.
Okay. So that being said, a lot of churches might say to you, okay, well, the gospel to us as well as we also believe that mankind was separated and that God sent his son, Jesus Christ, into the world to restore that fellowship. Okay, but what makes, when you started on this discovery, I mean, that's kind of, you go to a church, any mainstream church, they're going to say, well, we believe that as well. So what makes, when you became a Christian and you started digging through the Bible, reading it from cover to cover, what made you start thinking, there's something that we're missing here, that the authors say this one thing, but what's happening here?
Well, I became a believer in 2005. I committed my life and confessed my faith in Jesus Christ in 2005, and had some wonderful teachers and mentors that brought me to that. But that was really the starting point, the beginning point of wanting to know, once I had genuine faith in my heart, which is a gift from God. I don't just wake up and decide to believe. When I receive faith and become a child of God, that is put into my heart by the Spirit who is sent by the Father. That faith is what makes me a spirit regenerated believer, a child of God. And that was really the beginning of my quest to understand, okay, what does it mean then? I believe that Jesus is real, that the Father sent him into the world. He died on a cross, was raised from the dead, is seated on high, is alive today, seated on the throne. I was kind of there like the Jews on the day of Pentecost with their arms out saying, what now?
Now what do we do?
What does this all mean? That was the beginning of my journey in 2005. I read the Bible for the very first time after I became a spirit regenerated believer. I had heard the gospel preached and taught for about 9 months. And after I confessed faith, I went and got my first Bible and began to study at the beginning of Matthew. I said, well, I'm going to start at the New Testament and walk through the New Testament. Different people do it different ways. That's how I did it. And that was the beginning of my journey of reading the Bible, wanting to understand, what does the Bible say and what does it mean? How is this book, the Bible, a recipe for walking out this faith? What does that mean? People have said that and I'm believing it. And so I wanted to start reading it and to launch onto that journey. And so that was the beginning of a long season of asking a lot of questions of my church leaders. One thing I always did, and still today, I believe in having authority over you. And I wanted to be honoring to the authority in the church that I belong to, honor and respect these people that God had not only put over me, but had used to usher me across the finish line to becoming a child of God. So I read the Bible, lots of questions, and brought my questions to my church leaders. That's been kind of my modus operandi from the beginning. And they were very honoring of my hunger and my desire to know, because as a new believer, I didn't know anything. And they were very honoring and played their roles, I thought, very well, to spend time with me, to take my questions, to answer. But there were things in that journey that I would read about, that I would learn, that I would bring to them to talk about, that sometimes it was almost like getting the deer in the headlights. It was they just didn't have answers for, or if they had answers, sometimes they just weren't satisfying. They didn't seem to really be getting to the crux of the issue. And of course, I'm all over the board as I'm reading here, bringing and having these discussions. But after about 3 or 4 years of that, it became very apparent that there's a holy grail in this whole discussion that doesn't get talked about a lot, but the holy grail is speaking in tongues. When it comes to the ministry of the Holy Spirit and the biblical idea of speaking in tongues, the New Testament idea of speaking in tongues, man, that's where the deer in the headlights, we're just not going to have that discussion. And that was hard for me, because that's a contradiction.
Now, so you're saying that the church you went to, because
is a non-charismatic
because I say, because speaking
Yeah.
in tongues when I grew up was that was everyone talked about that. Okay, so in the place that you were, the church that you were going to, that was the one thing that you kept reading about and ask questions, but it was kind of
it wasn't like I kept reading about it, but that's the one thing where it seemed to be that as we could talk about a lot of things and have the conversation, but when it came to that issue, the conversation's over. We're just not going to talk. And as I read and became convicted of what the Bible is saying and teaching, it's hard to read 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and not walk away saying that, hey, this is very important to the Apostle Paul. He said he prayed in tongues more than all of you. He's writing to the Corinthians. And he said, I would that all of you would speak in tongues. He doesn't want to exclude anybody from speaking in tongues. He wants all to speak in tongues. And he is saying, use me as your example. Imitate me, even as I imitate Christ. And so I just made a kind of a unilateral conviction after hearing a teaching online, or it was online, it was actually a CD as I'm driving, where the preacher was teaching on a day of Pentecost teaching, and he made a comment about speaking in tongues. He said, speaking in tongues is for every believer. If you don't speak in tongues, ask God for the gift of speaking in tongues and begin speaking. And with that, I was at my ranch. I put my truck in park. I was on a gravel road, got down on my hands and knees on the gravel road. It was dusk. I think it was December 24th, 2007. Yeah. And I'm on the road at dusk, prayed that prayer, Lord, I want my spiritual prayer language, and I'm not going to move from this spot till I have it. And I'm on my knees out on a dirt road, and I basically spoke one phrase that I believe the Lord gave me. And I said, okay. I got up and I went home. That was kind of the beginning for me of speaking in tongues. And I would pray that phrase for a number of months. Every time I prayed, I would voice those utterances along with the prayer with my mind. And it was about 3 months into it. And I'm going to get to the crux of the whole question here, but this is the preface. It was about three months into it that I got up in the middle of the night, went into my prayer closet. I actually had a prayer closet, still have a prayer closet, and confessed to the Lord, forgive me for my arrogance. This is what I said to him. I just said it kind of in those words, forgive me for my arrogance. Lord, I want to pray in my spiritual prayer language, all of it. And it just began for the first time just to flow. I would speak, and it wasn't just a phrase, but it was a continuous, as long as I wanted to pray in the spiritual prayer language, in utterances that I did not understand with my own mind. That was March the 5th of 2008. And so that was the beginning of my journey of really coming to have a spiritual prayer language. It was a very personal thing, a very private thing, a very scripturally oriented thing where it says it in the scriptures. And I want to have this in my life. And it was really a matter between me and the Lord to that point. And but my journey of wanting to understand, what does the Bible say, what does the Bible mean, continued. And I entered seminary to kind of add some structure. Went to Dallas Theological Seminary from the spring of 2007 and graduated with a THM in the winter of 2016. So it was almost 10 years. A lot of that while I was working, and about half of that 10 years I was still working full time. About half of it was in my post-career retired life, and at any rate, THM 2016. And it was, so here's the crux to your question. It was in my final course at Dallas Seminary in the autumn of 2016. It was the only class I had left, was the advanced exegesis, the advanced study of the book of Romans. And it just so happened it was going to be with my absolute favorite professor, and probably still my all-time favorite professor. His name, I'll tell you, his name is Dan Wallace. He is a world-renowned New Testament Greek scholar. His textbook on advanced Greek, actually his textbook on it is an intermediate on the study of New Testament Greek. It's standard textbook for most seminary study of biblical Greek. So he's world-renowned, and I actually got to study Greek under this man. And he was my last professor at Dallas Seminary, where I was going to study the book of Romans. And it's the only class I had. So part of the class involved, the class requirements involved taking two very small passages in the book of Romans and doing detailed exegesis.
Can you tell us what exegesis is?
Exegesis, thank you. Exegesis is just bringing out the meaning. Exegesis means just draw the meaning out of the text. That's what exegesis means.
Okay.
So to do two papers on very narrow passages in Romans, that was a big chunk of the work in the class. And since it was my only class, I said, well, I don't have anything else to do study-wise. So I said, well, I'm just going to do the whole book of Romans. And it's almost, looking back on it, kind of comical. Nobody ever does that. In fact, this class is very intimidating to most seminarians. It kind of considered the most difficult course at Dallas Seminary for a THM degree is this advanced exegesis of Romans. And so to presume to say, where they have the requirement for two narrow passages, to presume to say that you're going to do the whole book of Romans is almost comical.
Did you tell anybody that was your plan?
No,
or just
I
told
didn't
yourself?
tell anybody. I just, in the summer, as I was preparing for the course, I just kind of embarked on that journey that I'm just going to exegete, draw out the meaning of the entire text, beginning at Romans 1:1 all the way to the end, Romans, I think it's 16:27, and just methodically work through it and exegete the entire book and translate the entire book. And I did that and finished remarkably. As I look back on it, almost can't believe that I actually did it, but I did get my first pass all the way through the entire book of Romans, right up at the end of the class that I finished. I translated the entire book of Romans and did a first run exegetical investigation into the meaning of the text, word by word, phrase by phrase, verse by verse, in the Greek text, bringing out the meaning into my vernacular language, English. So it was somewhere in that process, about midway through the class, that I have to say that I wasn't anticipating this. I wasn't expecting that. It was not my agenda to find some secret meaning or unknown meaning. I was just doing the class.
Okay, so let me ask a question. Sorry, I need to interrupt. So when you say this is different, if everybody in the class is taking a small phrase and bringing out the meaning, it's not the same as translating. You're not just taking the Greek word and translating it word for word. Okay. So wouldn't that be that everyone should be coming up with the same meaning?
Well, you might think that, but one of the things that I discovered in this process of working through Romans is that the systematic nature of Romans. In other words, to really understand what's going on in chapter 2, verse 2:1, and moving forward, you really have to have a good foundation, a good understanding of what Paul has just done in chapter 1. If you just jump into chapter 2 and start right there, missing all of the context established in chapter 1, you're not going to know what Paul's doing.
So it's kind of a wrong thinking that a student would just come in and choose two passages or small passages and just go for it. That really the only way to do it would be to start at the beginning.
Well, that I will say by accident, that is actually what I discovered.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not anything I thought in advance. Like, I can't go do 2 passages and understand them if I don't know the beginning from the end. That wasn't my thinking.
You just had an idea of, I've got time.
I just said, I got time. I'm going to do the whole book of Romans.
Okay, then.
And I started at verse 1:1 and began slowly, methodically working my way from passage to passage, beginning at the beginning. And one of the discoveries I made about Romans is it is in a way that most people, most pastors, most college professors don't really grasp, don't really understand that Romans, among all the books of the New Testament, I don't think there's another book in the New Testament like Romans in this regard. It is a systematic, outlined argument from beginning to end. Paul is methodically building an argument for the gospel. He has a starting point. He builds it entirely and ends it at 16:27. And so what I discovered through that process is, because I started at the beginning, because I exegeted every passage, every verse in light of everything that came before it, that when I exegeted and drew out the meaning of Romans 3:1, it was with the entirety of the first 2 chapters completed, understood in their context as Paul was building his argument, so that I could then move on to verse 3:1 and exegete that, draw out the meaning of that, fully in light of everything that came before it. A lot of people don't understand that. I didn't understand that. It was a process of working through that. So it was about midway through the course that I want to say,
hold on, I want to set, I'm going to try to.
You're setting this up.
I am. I'm trying to just recap. So you are taking a class. You've decided, okay, I've got time. There was nothing arrogant about this. You're just, I've got time. Instead of pulling a couple passages.
It was kind of most people would have laughed at it. Yeah, see how that works out for you.
But kind of almost your own personal challenge to yourself, like, well, why not? I've got the time. It might even, I might enjoy this. Or so you said, I'm just going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to start at Romans 1:1 and start pulling the meaning out of each of these line by line
in the original
in
Greek
the
text.
original Greek
Yeah,
text.
studying words and terms on how they were used in the ancient
So
world.
you had going into it, you had no idea what you were about to pull out. You just we're just gonna go through
I
it.
said, I got time. I'm going to do this.
Okay. Okay. So I'm caught up with you.
Yeah. So about mid-semester, I want to say, and so by that time, Romans is 16 chapters, probably by the time I got through chapter 8, right? The famous chapter 8 of Romans. I got through chapter 8, which in the Romans outline, the solution of the sin problem of man is the end of chapter 3 through the end of chapter 8. And so about halfway through the course, I had gotten through chapter 8 through this process. And so I'm exegeted chapter 8 in light of the fullness of the first 7 chapters, work through chapter 8. It's kind of like, I want to say, not to use terminology that might kind of sound like loaded, but the light really did go off. Suddenly, I really understood this difficult concept about the gospel that Paul's been building toward, that he's been building toward, that I kind of coined. I'm trying to find terminology that didn't exist to describe it. The only way I could describe it is Paul had a two-dimensional theology of justification. And today I call it a God's two-dimensional theology of salvation. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that here in the coming weeks.
Oh, yeah.
But it just, the light just went on that there's a forensic justification and there's a sanctifying justification. And one's a near purpose of God and the other's an end purpose of God. And this is what Paul's talking about. And he's almost entirely focused on this end purpose. And in church, in all of the discussion about salvation, about justification, churches almost always kind of get stuck on the near purpose, forensic justification, that initial coming to faith.
Getting as many people into heaven as we can.
And this whole realm that Paul's talking about, that separate, subsequent to, it's correlated to forensic, but it's this realm of sanctifying justification kind of gets lumped in with this near purpose in the church and discussions and understandings, but not with Paul. With Paul, they're very distinct, very correlated, right? You got to have the beginning in order to launch into the end purpose. But his entire focus is on this end purpose, on the sanctifying justification that he would come to call in chapter 12 at the beginning, spiritually spoken worship. And that's why Romans 12:1 and 2 are two of my favorite verses, because it so captures the essence of that end purpose. But to answer your question, it was about halfway through the class, I think, when I'd finally worked my way through chapter 8, that the light went off, that Paul he's got this two-dimensional theology of the salvation plan of God, and the way he talks about that very important theological term, justification. There's two dimensions to it. There's a near purpose, there's an end purpose, and he almost takes the near purpose for granted. And
just assuming that you already,
so that the book of Romans is to those whom God has redeemed, who are walking in forensic justification. Then Paul writes Romans for them. So he almost takes that near purpose, that forensic justification, that initial coming to faith, which is a sovereign act of God, takes that for granted. And he's writing to the people of God, those whom God has redeemed. He's writing to them to teach them, exhort them into this end purpose of God, which I refer to as sanctifying justification. And it was about midway through the course, through chapter 8, that the light finally went on what Paul is doing. What's he arguing for? What's he building here? He's building a case for this end purpose of God's salvation plan. that is so unworldly, so difficult. It's like what Peter wrote in 2 Peter, I think it's 3:16. Some of the things our beloved brother Paul wrote are difficult to understand. They are difficult. This is Peter writing 30 years into his ministry as an apostle, writing that these things this guy Paul writes, they're really hard to understand, and they are. And but it was only through that was the process that got me there to where for the very first time I really understood the argument that Paul was building in Romans all the way through, and his overriding umbrella primary focus, not on that near purpose of God's forensic justification, which he talks about it in a very limited way.
Because it's a given to him.
It's a given.
But the people he's talking to already have that.
He's not writing to the lost.
Okay. Which is a big deal, because I always grew up reading Romans thinking that it was a book to the lost.
Yeah, no, Romans is a book to the children of God, those who have faith to believe. Paul says, here's Romans, here's what you need to understand about your faith.
So when you were first reading, when you were, early in your journey to all this, you were reading the Bible much the way I was reading the Bible, just it's all about faith to believe.
I was just reading an English Bible, working through it, saying, what does this mean? And, in fact, before I had started reading the Bible, when I went and bought my first Bible, I can still remember. I was in my bedroom. I held the Bible in my hands, and I said a prayer. I said, Lord, I don't know what's in this book. I've never read it, but I'm going to read it. And I know I'm not going to understand everything in it. I know that. I know I'm not going to understand everything in it, but I'm not going to doubt anything being the truth. Even when I don't understand, I would say, this is the truth. I just don't understand it. And I said, I'm going to depend on you to show me the way, to help me understand. And that was in early September of 2005, about a month and a half after I became a confessed believer in the Lord.
And so as you're taking this class is when you you had this aha moment of, wait a minute, there's more than what's being taught. There's more, I don't want to say to what meets the eye, because if we're reading Paul correctly and it's being translated correctly, it's exactly what meets the eye. But you just had this aha moment of, wait a minute, this whole time we've just been talking about one thing, which is faith to believe, get as many people into heaven as we can. But Paul's sitting here talking about that there's so much more after that faith to believe. There's more than just
it's not just so much more. There's one thing.
Okay. And
Paul's focus is one thing. His entire focus, this realm of sanctifying justification, is this. If I could paraphrase Paul, it's you have faith to believe. God has done a sovereign work in your heart, giving you faith to believe in his son, Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of sins. Then let me tell you about your faith. The Father wants one thing from you. He wants you to worship him in spirit and in truth, which is in spiritual union with the Son, Jesus Christ, who sends the Holy Spirit that indwells. You become the temple of God, and the rhema of God, the rhema of Christ, are the unknowable utterances that come forth from your mouth that God is creating, he's doing in the world. We'll probably talk about, what is that? What is he doing with these unknowable utterances? That's going to be part of our conversation. But for Paul, that's everything. That's the gospel. That's why when Paul wrote Romans, he called Romans, this is Paul speaking, my gospel. In Romans 2:16 and Romans 16:25, he calls the book of Romans my gospel. That's why in Stauros commentary series that I've written, I call Romans, the gospel of Paul. And because Paul calls it his gospel, it's his teaching about this end purpose of God, which is spiritually spoken worship, which is, he doesn't use the word tongues in Romans, never uses the word tongues in Romans, but he makes, probably, you've heard, if you follow our teaching, Robin takes one of these every week. There are over 40 references directly to speaking in tongues in Romans, but Paul uses different terminology for it. That's one of the things Robin is doing each week as I do my teachings on Sunday. She talks about one of those areas in Romans where he's talking about speaking in tongues, but uses different terminology for it. The entire book of Romans is about that one thing. It's about spiritually spoken worship. God's given you faith to believe. He wants you to walk in what Paul called, he bookended Romans with this, Romans 1:5, Romans 16:26, with this idea of the obedience from faith. God's given you faith to believe. He wants you to walk in the obedience from faith, which is spiritually spoken worship. That's it, church. That's the one thing the Father wants from his children.
So when you had this aha moment, was there any one verse, one word that just was like, oh?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I think it might have been the culmination of having begun at Romans 1:1 and worked all the way through Romans 8, chapter 8. And those of you that are familiar with Romans 8 know what I'm talking about. That is has some of the most revered single verses in the entire Bible that people like to talk about, like to quote, can come out of Romans 8.
Romans 8:28. For all of sin.
Yeah.
That's Romans 8:28.
Yeah.
Now, when you had this aha moment, what did you do with it? Did you take it to this professor?
No.
Would you just sit there?
No, I just continued my journey. I'm got butterflies inside as this light is coming on. And that might be a better way to say it. It's almost like a rheostat, that the light's getting brighter and brighter as
like
I'm
you're
working.
turning it up.
So it's not necessarily like a switch went on as much as it's a rheostat.
That's it.
Turning as I'm working through Romans.
Okay.
The light is getting brighter and brighter of what Paul's doing.
Because I'm thinking just here. This light bulb, and I would be running out telling everybody. It's kind of more just that's
probably not
better.
The best analogy.
Just this light is slowly turning on.
Better analogy is a rheostat. Just slowly turning on as I work my way through.
That actually kind of makes more sense, because I'm thinking if you just had this one brilliant moment, you'd be running out waving, but is it
But
slowly
I think
learning?
that it was really, by the time I got through Romans chapter 8, that I was really beginning to gain a full understanding of what's Paul doing in Romans. And what he's doing in Romans is building methodically the case for the faith practice of speaking in tongues. The best rendering of it in Romans is 12:1, spiritually spoken worship. The entire book of Romans is Paul's systematic theology of the Christian faith about God's given you faith to believe. That's an assumption. That's a given. Here's what God wants you to do with your faith. And he's writing the letter of Romans. One of the reasons it's so complicated and difficult, he's writing it for his Jewish brothers back in Judea who are really struggling with this. They're really struggling with this idea of what is, faith to believe. What does God want us to do with our faith? What about Moses? Is Moses sunsetted, or is Moses syncretized in part of it? They're grappling with all these questions, which of course for Paul, no, Moses is sunsetted. Moses is, the dispensation of Moses is over. Well, the Jews weren't really there. They weren't really ready to say that Jesus is the fulfillment. Now Moses is sunsetted. They weren't going to do that. So a big part of why Romans is so difficult is Paul is methodically, systematically wanting to unravel a lot of bad theology, bad tradition that the Jews are getting wrapped around, wanting to syncretize Moses with Christian faith.
Are these educated Jews?
Oh, yeah. They're very educated, yeah.
So that's probably why.
Maybe in a different context than we think about educating today. but they were educated in terms of the Hebrew scriptures and the Jewish tradition and how to interpret the Hebrew
The reason
scriptures.
why I asked that is because, kind of how I asked that pointed question to you at the very beginning. Well, what are you arrogant enough to say you've had this meaning when there's so many different scholars or people that read the Bible that haven't drawn this meaning out? First of all, I think it's a huge difference when you start at the beginning, knowing what he's writing, and go all the way through pulling it out. But the reason why I ask if they're educated is because for me, even just in the basic, and I will say it this way, dumbed down NIV, because I truly believe that that's what the NIV is now. Is that okay to say? That when I read it, that's even hard to understand. And I could never connect the dots. I'm like, well, Paul says this at one point, but he says this at one point, and I don't understand. So I just stopped. If they're educated and he's writing on a level that's even, because we are kind of dumbed down a little bit, then it would make sense that it's going to take more than just pulling a scripture out here or there to understand what Paul's saying. Yeah. And where we have the problem is in our Christian tradition these days, the only way we read the Bible is usually our devotion in the morning, that someone uses their own thoughts and words, and then they put a little scripture at the bottom. Well, if that's the only Bible that we're getting, then it would only make sense that we're not understanding it properly. But if you're starting at the beginning of Romans, understanding, first of all, who he's writing to, why he's writing it, then I'm going back to the original language of this brilliant man who has been studied in the scriptures, knows the Torah at beginning, in and out, has been taught by 3 years by Jesus, by the Spirit himself, is writing to these other educated men who themselves know the Torah. They know, and they do have faith to believe. That is a completely, entirely different scenario than just pulling Romans 8:28 out at the end of your devotion. That's why I asked that.
What you just articulated about the history in the early church and Paul and the whole milieu that he was operating in, you know an awful lot. And I was just listening that amazed at the story. For those of you listening, she just put together a pretty good summary of what's going on there with Paul. Highly educated, very intelligent, dealing with highly educated Jewish religious people back in Jerusalem, and saying, how do I convince my Jewish brothers who are not understanding, they're not getting the fullness of this strange new way of restored fellowship with the Father through the Son, Jesus Christ. They're not understanding it. How do I penetrate that barrier?
And it is a strange fellowship, because before you had a high priest that went behind a curtain that no one knew what they were doing. And now you're saying, what, we have this fellowship to where before you don't even
Yeah,
walk.
the temple in Jerusalem is done. It's over.
And I bet they are kind of, what do we do? Okay, so the reason I wanted to say that we do have some listeners, because we have had comments. We've had listeners who've listened to this and might look at Stephen or look at Robin saying, well, who are these people? I've had people say to my face, well, he thinks this is this, that's kind of arrogant. So after saying all that about the way Paul is writing, I actually would like someone to think about, isn't it more arrogant that someone who just is going to write their own words and their own thoughts and just take something that Paul wrote and throw it at the end of it and stamp it as good, call us good? Actually, they probably stamp it as Agathos good. But anyways, they're just going to stamp it as good and say, we know exactly what Paul was talking about. We know exactly what the Bible means, and this is what it means. This is my thinking, my thoughts. I'm putting it into my words. I'm just going to put that scripture at the end of it and say, yes, this is, you go on about your day, trusting that exactly what I said in my little description of the verse is true. That is actually way more arrogant than what I would say Stephen is saying right now. That's why I wanted to take us back to this journey and say there's no arrogance in this. There's no arrogance in what we believe. There's no arrogance in what the there's no arrogance in what Stephen is teaching. It's actually just going back and learning what Paul was teaching instead of just assuming what Paul's teaching. It's actually learning and studying and digesting and meditating on it and
methodically. From beginning, don't jump into the middle, but right from the beginning, understanding it methodically through. And I'm not sure, Sarah, that there's another book in the New Testament that you could do that, because there's not, having exegeted most of the New Testament now, and I will finish the entire New Testament, but having exegeted most of the New Testament, there's nothing else like Romans in terms of a systematic. You can tell that once you understand Romans in the context that I've described here, where he is as best he can, he's making a methodical case for the faith to take back to Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem right after he writes Romans.
He's sitting down thinking, how can I explain to these people?
How can I explain to them methodically, beginning to end? Romans is where he does that. He doesn't do that anywhere else. And so maybe, was I just lucky? I don't know. But for whatever reason, I started at Romans 1:1 and walked through, trying as best I was able at the end of my 10 years of THM studies at Dallas Seminary, having studied Hebrew for 2 years, having studied Greek for 2 years, and being able to go back into the ancient world, into their history, into their milieu, and discern what Paul is doing word by word, verse by verse, all the way through the book of Romans. To understand the fullness of what he's doing, what's he arguing for, and what is he doing in, for instance, chapters 9 through 11, where he's really engaging with Judaism, and starting at chapter 12, then, where he begins to engage obedience to the faith. Is how do you walk this out, work this out? So he describes the salvation plan of God, talks in great detail about the whole Jewish milieu in chapters 9 through 11, and then the rest, chapters 12 to the end, about walking now in obedience to this faith. It's a very methodical walk.
I don't think that's luck. I'm going to tell you what you always tell me. It's because you're a learner, right? That's what you always tell me. That's not luck. That's wanting to get in there and understand and learn.
But I look back on the whole, I guess, gift, if you will, that I had for that last class. That's my only class. And then I'm done. I'm going to graduate with a THM. I got one class left. It's the hardest class that Dallas Seminary has on exegeting Romans. I'm going to have it with my favorite professor, who is a world-renowned New Testament Greek professor. And I've got this gift on my plate, and I'm going to say innocently, naively said, well, I'm just going to exegete the entire book of Romans. And I did it. And mid-December, at the end of the class, I barely kind of limped across the finish line at the end of chapter 16. And I had it was about a 250-page work of first pass. The work I have now on Romans has developed a lot since then. It's about 800 pages now. But at that point, my first walk through it, it was 250 pages, my own translation and my own commentary, exegesis, drawing out the meaning of the text of the entire book of Romans. Every word, every phrase, every verse, begun at the beginning, methodically, all the way through to the end. Was it it was definitely a gift, accident, naive, it's like, did I have a stupid attack thinking I was going to do that at the time? However you want to characterize it, that's what happened. And that's the short season, 3 to 4 months. That's the short season where like a rheostat. I think that's a good
Yeah.
analogy or metaphor, like a rheostat slowly turning through the course of that 3-4 month period. Paul's argument in Romans just
Came to the surface.
blossomed before me. And yeah, once that light, I knew there was a rheostat turning. Man, I was excited.
Can't stop.
I was highly motivated to continue the process because I was slowly seeing what this brilliant apostle 1800 years ago was doing, what he was writing about, what his agenda was, what his mission was, his burning desire for his Jewish brethren, that they would finally understand that Moses is done. His dispensation is over. Now it's only Jesus in this spiritual realm of worship to the Father in spirit and truth. That was Paul's singular focus when he took the gospel to the Gentiles and he goes into new cities and new regions. His singular focus is to see who the Father is going to give faith to so that he could gather them together and teach them this end purpose of God, to become spiritual worshipers of God. That's Romans. And then once you understand Romans, that becomes the Holy Grail, the key to unlock the meaning of the rest of the New Testament, because no other books in the New Testament are systematic, outlined the way Romans is. But once you have that meaning of what Paul was doing in Romans, you can go to every other book in the Bible, including the 4 Gospels, and understand through that key that this is what the Father's doing. This is why Jesus came. This is why Jesus died on the cross. This is why Jesus sits on the throne. He's not just sitting there. He's speaking. He is speaking. And he's looking for subjected followers here on earth that are his body to release that speaking into the creation. That's the gospel, church. That's it.
Well, I appreciate you taking us on that journey. And as we get back, like I said, back to the basics, and next week, we're going to just pick up kind of where we left off on then what happened as you're turning this light up. So
what do we do with it?
Yeah. What did you do with it? Where, that's where we're going to go next week.
All right.
If you want to tune in, Steve and I have talked before, but I heard it again today. Just I love that way he said, just kind of the light. I've never heard of the term rheostat. I didn't know that's what it was, but just that slow fade, not fade, but the slow brightening of the light coming up. That's a great way to describe what happened as you were methodically going through Romans. So thank you for taking us on that journey. And I'm excited for next week to pick up where we left off and hear a little bit more about what happened after you turned in your paper and where we went from there. So if you're excited to tune in, if you have questions, if you have comments, let us know. And
well, I'm excited about doing this 10-part series.
Me too.
That you're calling Back to Basics.
Back to the Basics.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, thank you, church. Thank you for joining us. And hopefully we'll be back on Sunday with continuing our teaching in the book of James. I wanted to continue this last weekend, but circumstances didn't allow it. But we're still walking through James. We'll continue in chapter 2 of James this Sunday. And then we'll be back with you, Sarah, next Wednesday.
That's right. We'll see y'all then.
We'll see you then.
Oh, sorry.